Now introduce the speaker, the first speaker for the day, Dr. Neeraja Sundaram from Azim Premji University, Bangalore. As we know, she is an alumna of the Department of English, which gives us considerable pleasure and pride to welcome her. Dr. Neeraja Sundaram received her MPhil and PhD in English Studies from the University of Hyderabad. Her doctoral research lies at the intersection of literature and the health humanities and focuses on questions of narrative and identity in the context of illness experience. As part of exploring connections between the story of a disease event in individuals and societies and a cultural transaction in meaning that occurs via its reception, she has worked on a range of media texts and forms, but those of special interest to her are the memoir, medical documentary, and comics and graphic narratives. She has completed a manuscript for Orient Black Swan's literary context series, which aims to provide accessible introductions to teaching and learning key periods in English writing, and has published in journals such as Postcolonial Text and the Indian Journal of Gender Studies. She'll be speaking to us today on Poststructuralism and IWE. May I now invite Dr. Neeraja Sundaram.
Okay. Hi everyone, and good morning, and I'm very happy to be here. It's been said to you many times that I'm an alumnus of the department, so it saves me the trouble of introducing myself that way. I thought perhaps they may not say that and wait until the end of the talk to see if they want to say that this is someone who graduated from our department, but clearly they decided to hedge their bets. So I think that I'll say a couple of more things, I think, by way of introduction, just to add to what has been said about things I'm interested in. I am quite interested in pedagogy, that is teaching and learning related to theory. Not necessarily by design, but I've sort of ended up teaching theory to undergraduate students for a long time now. And so it is something that I'm interested in thinking about, right? And I do feel like Dr. Nair has also talked about this. Introduction to theory, in some sense, can be, it can be very invigorating, but it can also feel, very frightening. I don't know how many of you have experienced that in some form already. Can I get a quick show of hands if people have, in some form or the other, encountered some kind of theory in their education so far, like a formal course on theory? Okay, so quite a few of you. Okay, so in that sense, I think you will kind of relate to this idea, right? That it's often something that's either can be a stumbling block, or it can be something that can be very useful. So what I think hope to do today is approach this not necessarily in an enormously or as comprehensive a way as possible, right? So it's not going to be a scheme or a map of every post-structuralist thinker or the degree of impact or influence this school of criticism has had. But I do want to say, I think, to start with, that it is a good, or it is I think a good sort of thing to think about as a gateway theory. So it's a good gateway theory, right? A lot of the concepts and terms and a lot of the ideas that have been introduced by this school of criticism is something that you will encounter many times in subsequent schools of thought. So even over the course of this particular, this particular work symposium that's been planned, you will find that a lot of the moves, right, or a lot of the conceptual explanations that we'll kind of make our way through recur in specialized form in several of the schools that you'll encounter over the 2 days. So in that sense, I think it's a good place to start. I've thought about this as an introduction to someone who has not encountered theory before. So since many of you have raised your hands for this, maybe you can think about this as having some overlap with content you may have already encountered, but I've put it together in a way that also explores connections between thinkers and looks at implications for our everyday life. So maybe we can talk about that a little, and you can tell me if you feel like there were aspects you'd like to ask me about. I've chosen a couple of key concepts, and then, I have a part of the presentation which just looks at what this would look like if we were to just broadly look at Indian writing in English as a framework, as a body of text or a body of literature, and if we were to use these concepts there, what that would look like. right? So that's kind of the overview for what I'm going to discuss. So thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to be a part of this. I think it's been a really nice opportunity. I've enjoyed doing the small things that I've contributed to the project. And a small word of thanks also to Atul and Meenakshi for excellent support in the days leading up to the symposium. So I think that kind of concludes some of my formal sort of introductory remarks, right? So let's move forward. There are many ways, I think, to think about post-structuralism as being rooted somewhere, right? Even though once we get to the end of this, you will find that, this is something that post-structuralism is perhaps avowedly against, right? Wanting to be rooted somewhere. But where does one begin, right? So there are many ways to think of this history. You can think of the social context, something that, I don't think often gets explored in class. But then this is a good place to begin as an intellectual history for post-structuralism. That is to begin with structuralism. And this is not necessarily to be thought of as a chronological ordering of ideas, right? So I don't necessarily want to give the impression that here were a set of ideas that were later then, improved upon in some way. But I do want to root our understanding of some of the concerns and questions that are brought up in post-structuralism in the immediate context of structuralism itself, right? So I think most of you would have come across the idea of the linguistic sign and signification. And who is responsible for Saussure? Okay, excellent, right? So what we have here then is the basis for a school of criticism in something that is very deeply invested in language, right? And the study of language, and a certain kind of study of language, right? A study of language that is very interested in finding what we can talk about as a universal grammar. Right? So the thing I want to state at the very outset and that I want you to take away from this is that yes, we begin with structuralism, we begin with Saussure and what Saussure has taught us about language, but also to keep in mind that in some senses, the core aspect of structuralism that we're going to emphasize here is this idea that you're dealing with something ordered, right? Something whose pattern, whose underlying grammar and structure can be predicted and studied in some way, right? And that idea begins with language. So I'm just going to leave this quote up here. I don't know if the specific quote is something that you've looked at. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to take a look at the quote. Why is this important for us? It's important for us from the perspective of English studies because, why is there, this borrowing, right, from something that is in some sense linguistics, right? What does literary studies have to do with this? So for us, it has to do with being concerned with meaning making, right? Our interest is in meaning making. How do we make meaning? How do we make sense of ourselves? How do we make sense of our relationship with the world? How do we make sense of each other? How do we communicate this with one another, right? So the business of studying literary texts, the business of understanding the sense that, those who are reading these texts are making from them, for us in some sense is really bound up with what you get out of a communication system like this, right? So if for us, at the very outset, the important idea here is about meaning making. So what are the specific contributions that are made by Saussure, and if you look at this quote, what kind of stands out in the context of language, meaning making, and what Saussure is saying? What are some of the things that are important or interesting to keep in mind? Do you want to say a bit more about what you mean by social context? You're right, and I think that you're speaking from the point of view of contract signed by the individual and community. Okay, so what I would say is that, so thank you for that. So what I would say for now is that, let us not immediately try to make that one-to-one correspondence between the theory and what we want to do with Indian writing. We'll get there. I want us to pay attention to some of the things that are sort of interesting or novel about what Saussure is saying about the sign, right? What is he saying about the sign that is interesting? And what is, also when I first came across it, was terribly shocking. It seems commonsensical, right, when you think about it in retrospect, but it's kind of shocking. What's that shocking thing?
That auditory image associated with a kind of concept.
Okay, what's so shocking about that? I mean, everybody's looking at the tree and it's called tree, right? Why is that shocking?
But we didn't think of it in that way before, that if there is a certain tree and then we have a word for it, but then the moment I say that word, it comes to my mind.
Right? So there's something here that someone's trying to explain to you about the correlation between these two things, right? How is this process taking place? I have a word, I have a way that I can understand that word and I can choose it from a system of words, and then I can sort of guarantee that if I use that word to a set of people, those set of people are able to understand it. How is this whole process happening? That's kind of what Saussure is explaining, right? So the shocking thing that he's saying is that it doesn't really matter. Right? You can replace this term with a number of other terms. You can, replace, and then you can in some sense have a lot of shading for that concept, right? It doesn't just have to be this, but it could be various stages of that thing in a life cycle of growth, right? And depending on the culture or the kind of language you speak, you might have a range of terms for it, right? So this is the novel or interesting thing that he's pointing out, that there is a absolutely arbitrary connection between the kind of signifier and signified correlation that exists, right? I can use any kind of term and indicate a kind of concept with it, but it is important that it is agreed upon by a community. So these two things are important, right? That he's not necessarily saying that anyone is free to speak as they please. He's saying the opposite, right? That you cannot speak as you please. Even if you develop a private language with your friend that's only relevant to the two of you, you'll still have to establish the rules of speaking before you go ahead, right? So it is not rooted in the individual, meaning you don't just speak language. It doesn't flow out of you, in this kind of unbidden way without any rules, right? There are rules. You learn the rules very early and hence forget. In some sense, it seems very natural. And it's useful to think about this. For those of you who may still be making sense of this, it's useful to think about it in terms of languages you don't know. So when you're learning a language you don't know, you often come across this kind of stumbling block, right? There is never one-to-one correlation. You're trying to explain it while the other person says, no, there is no word for this. I'm not quite sure if you can communicate this concept. So there are a lot of, in that sense, negotiating of the system, right? What's also important here from the point of view of structuralism, which in some sense post-structuralism is, using, is that linguistic systems, right? This linguistic system is pretty much the only thing that we have to make sense of the world. That's also something that was very different that Saussure is pointing out. Yeah, is this making sense so far? That essentially for you, making sense of the world depends entirely on this system. This system that you understand as a world of exchanges, as a kind of, one-to-one correspondence. You have a concept, you can exchange it for another one or not exchange it for another one, and you learn and get better at using this system, and that's pretty much all you have, right? Even the thoughts you think or, what you say to yourself, there is very little non or extra linguistic, in that sense, way of making sense of the world, right? So it's a very, in that sense, overwhelming sense of how much language determines what you understand of the world. Now, these are important, I think, landmarks for the way in which structuralism takes off and is important as a way of making sense of the world, right? How many of you have come across these names? Okay. So these are important sort of landmarks, right? From the point of view of how structuralism moves away from a focus on language alone, and in some sense starts to become a mode of recognizing patterns in pretty much as many things as you can find that comprise your world and that you make meaning from, right? So these are important landmarks to make sense of how that idea of an implied order in terms of method, right? What are structuralists doing? I mean, aside from saying to us that, look, signs and signifiers and signifieds have arbitrary links, and that in some sense you're governed by the system and that you have no agency to change that. Aside from that, they're also, in terms of method, what they really contributed and what becomes important for post-structuralism as a starting point is this idea that you can predict pattern, recognize an underlying grammar in a lot of things. So we start with this, idea of reading cultural science that, Roland Barthes is doing. Do you recognize the image and where it's from? Do you want to tell me?
It's from
Okay,
It's
yeah.
from Paris
Yeah,
magazine.
yeah. And so what does he say about the...
He's talking about the person and how they are looking towards the flag,
Mhm.
and how it's telling you that the person is in love with Paris,
Mhm.
not just the people of France, but also the colonies who are outside France. They are also in love with the idea of the French government.
Mhm.
The colonies are also there. So the whole idea that the connotation and denotation comes in.
Excellent. So, for those of you who haven't encountered the idea of connotation and denotation, this is an important sort of way in which Barthes is using this idea of an implied order, because he's looking at a slightly more granular level of implied order in the language, where on the one hand, okay, yes, there is this sense of, a linguistic system that is based on agreement among a community. But he says also culturally specific codes are present, which, in some sense people are able to unpack, which is what he just did, right? That some things are standing out here, right? That the ordering of this is a magazine cover. Everyone recognizes it as a magazine cover, right? Did you? I mean, even if you haven't seen this particular magazine, you can see it's a magazine cover. So the idea here is that, a school of thought that originated in looking at an underlying pattern or grammar in language is able to give you a system for making sense of cultural signs which are patterned in similar ways, right? We all have that mode of understanding that this is how a magazine cover looks. And that these codes are not, they're not absolutely random, right? They're organized and arranged in a way that it gives us a certain sense of what we're looking at. So the racial aspect of what is highlighted in that image, right? A young black soldier who salutes a French flag, right? A kind of submissiveness, or in some sense, a sense of, great loyalty to a nation that may have once, been responsible for colonizing you. That's something that Barthes is interested in. And he's saying that that kind of happens in two orders. There's one order of signification where you see that one person is saluting a flag, there are a set of signs you interpret in that literal way, but you also have some connotative meanings associated with that. Levistro is important for us, will become important for us also as we move forward and see what post-structuralists are saying about the idea of this implied order. But Levistro is using the idea of an implied order for kinship, right? He studies kinship systems, and he's again looking at people and the way that they're exchanged through marriage, right? How are people, what kind of exchanges happen in families through marriage? Are women being exchanged? Women move in one direction, livestock moves in one direction, right? There are ways in which people are made sense of as units of trade in a say cultural exchange like marriage, and in the way that property passes, in the way that family structures are organized. He also comes up with some very interesting ways of absolutely boiling down these universal sort of pairs, right, or these opposites that you can use to describe whole cultures. Does anyone know what these were? What were these? Like, he had these kind of binary pairs, right? These sets of paired opposites that can describe any culture. He studied primitive cultures really, but do you sorry?
The bricolage.
Not exactly. So this one is, so he talks about raw and cooked, and he talks about the incest taboo. Okay, so the raw and cooked is actually a very interesting way of making sense of the world for all of us, right? It makes a lot of sense to many of you as well, I'm sure, that you understand some kind of essential difference in the world in terms of raw and cooked, right? You can have health on the one side, not health on the other side, depending on the context, right? You can now necessarily also, think of cultural connotations, caste connotations, who cooks, can you accept cooked food from someone, do you only accept raw food from someone? So in some sense, groups of people made sense of each other and their everyday life based on this essential distinction between raw and cooked. That's something that Levistro proposes. He also kind of proposes that universally, he's interested in universal kind of orders, right? He's interested in saying as many, so basically the theory is better the more number of people that it applies to. Okay, The other interesting sort of universal principle that he comes up with is the incest taboo. Okay, what's the incest taboo? The incest taboo is basically this idea that you cannot, in some sense, have sexual relations with a blood relation. But what was interesting about this particular kind of taboo, and which is something that, you know, Derrida picks up on later, is that somehow while everybody has an incest taboo, everybody's kind of incest taboo is different. Okay, and here is also something that I think is very relatable to many of us, right? So many of you will have come into contact with cultures where the kind of taboos in marriage or the kind of taboos in the way relationships are supposed to proceed with people are slightly different. You can say as a broad principle that there are rules, and that there are rules that govern, you know, your sexual relations, there are rules that govern your domestic affairs, but they are slightly differently interpreted in each context. So this is an important thing to remember, right? The universal, but also the slightly problematic existence of variations of the universal. Lastly, there are many narratologists that, you know, in some senses, if you look up, or if you look at narratology just as a discipline that studies the ordering and patterning of stories, you will find many variations of how this underlying principle has been studied. But Prop is interesting for having made a kind of compendium of all the things that are, you know, common among the folktale, right? So what are the different story elements? Do they occur in the same kind of ways? Do people do the same kind of things? I had one thing here about just, you know, how structuralist approaches look in the context of this kind of universal principle, right? So if you want to think of something that you may have come across in your everyday life, so even if you necessarily haven't had this formal introduction to literary theory and a chronology, even if you're kind of reading reviews, right, of things you read or things you watch, certainly you come across this prediction of patterns that's happening, right? People kind of writing and telling you what it means to have a genre. What is the genre essentially, if not to identify a kind of formula? Right? That's what you're doing. You're finding this underlying principle that unites all these different kinds of stories that you're finding something common with. You're also saying that this is not a good example of this genre, this is a bad example of this genre, this is a classic example of this. Right? What are you doing essentially if not predicting patterns? Right? You're finding the paraphrasable content, right? The kind of kernel narrative that's here, the absolute bare minimum in this narrative that seems to occur across all of the aspects of this. So at this point, let me just stop and see if I can get some more responses for the way that we can think about this. How many of you like watching horror films? Fewer hands went up than the number of people. So you're into theory, but not really so much into horror films. I find that so interesting. So I wondered, those of you who raised your hands, if you want to tell me what are the kinds of very predictable formulas that you find in a horror film? What makes a horror film a horror film? How do you know that that's what that is? The music is there. Okay. Okay, so you guys are now banned from future responses. Let's hear from the others. So I'm taking from you music and jump scares, very technical I feel. More, you can give me just like very, very kind of broad-based general stuff, right? Anything that comes to mind. How do you know when you're watching a film that it's scary? Surely you must have seen films and said, this is not scary in the least.
Darkish places.
Okay, so darkness, this is an important element. What else?
Extreme religious practices like exorcism.
Okay. Shall we say extreme? Okay, so shall we say something extreme? Fine, extreme religious practices. Did you mean, I'm sorry, I don't know where the response came from. So like you mean related to the occult, that sort of thing?
Yeah, like exorcism.
Right, okay. What else?
Supernatural.
Supernatural elements. Okay.
Adding to that, like the fear of the unknown.
The fear of the unknown. Okay. Any more?
The houses, the man.
The houses? What kind of houses are they?
Very old kind of, ancient, very big.
Bungalows.
Yeah, like very
Decrepit.
Yeah, and also very old, like something might have happened to you now.
Okay.
Desolation.
Sorry?
The desolate places.
Isolation. Okay, so here's what I want you guys to just think about from these responses. Maybe there's not much agreement about it. There were a lot of people very silent, so I feel like there are a set of people in the middle who feel like no, horror films happen in crowded, densely packed cities in tiny apartments also, right? So, I mean, and if you're thinking that, you're right. But one of the things I want you to observe here is the way in which we are kind of conditioned to categorize this narrative into predictable locations. And think about how you're using narrative units, right? You're mentioning locations to me. None of you mentioned kinds of characters, but that's also true, right? Right? People who have, often people who are ailing, people who are, I mean, there's a lot of fainting going on, right? Someone who is very much on the border of life and death. Okay, so there are kind of, so you're predicting kinds of elements that occur in these kinds of stories, and, you know, establishing that if X number of these elements occur, then I have kind of decided that this is, right, a story that belongs in that genre. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. So just to sum up this section, right, because we looked a little bit at structuralism. We're at that point where we are saying that there is no inherent or intrinsic meaning, right, in that individual sign. This works at the level of the word too, right? We move from the word to texts, but in one sense it works at the level of the word, because there is no intrinsic value to that word, right? There is nothing intrinsic in tree that makes it sound or think or make you think of a tree, right? It was just something we came up with through agreement. The same is true of what you've been saying to me now about your horror film, right? Maybe you didn't feel so close to the horror film because it's something you feel is okay to be defiled as a category, but you might think a little harder if I told you that, you know, this is true in one sense of all kinds of text. So there's nothing unique about this beautiful sonnet that someone may have written, right, in the 17th or 18th century, because they kind of borrowed it from, you know, several people who went before them. And in some sense, what I'm really looking at is that there's no intrinsic value, right? There's nothing absolutely great about that individual, nothing original or created about that one text, but rather they come about through difference in the system, right? So this is a system that kind of encourages that difference, and there are a set of agreed upon principles that keep them in place, right? Have I had about 30 minutes? Okay. Okay. So this is a set of things that we've now established, right? That how we see the world is what we see and make sense of it. So, like I said, this was one kind of context that I wanted to give you for post-structuralism. If you'd like to think about others, maybe we can talk about them. But I wanted to sort of try and see, I mean, I'll keep this question open-ended. I don't really have like a response for it, right? Is it a critique of structuralism or an extension? I often find that it's not terribly useful to posit one school as a criticism of another, just because I think it implies a certain homogeneity in the set of people who have been grouped together by practices which are not necessarily always, something that they have, begun, right? So there are textbooks and anthologies and various other kinds of practices that put and group people together in certain ways. So there are criticisms, but is it absolutely a criticism is something that you can think about. Extension is, of course, an open-ended, safe way of comparing the two schools, right? Wherein you can see that there is a lot of similarities too. And so as we talk about post-structuralism, just try and keep that in mind. If you're making notes, then try and bear in mind, are there things that are similar? Are there things that are being built on? Are there similar kinds of things that are being worked out? So this is one thing that's kind of interesting about post-structuralism, which is that there is, depending on how you would like to think of a method, there may not be a very explicit method available, right? If you want to think of a method as something that gives you a set of tasks you can complete in a text and end up with a computed result, right? This can be done, right? In an analysis that is looking at the form and the context of a text, you have a way of going about it, right? What are you supposed to look at? You look at the structure of the text, you look at the texture of the text. There are ways in which structuralism really kind of allows you to do that, right? It really allows you to look at texts as being orderly, divided into beginnings, middles, and ends, or in a very orderly fashion fitting a genealogy of texts that in some sense they belong to, right? So there are very clear sets. And then you can make a principle to identify this in the text. But I'm not sure that you have that kind of method with post-structuralism. What comes close to a method is what can be thought of more as a critical approach or orientation. What do I mean by that? I mean a way of looking at the text and a way of, it's kind of a way of understanding what meaning is. What is meaning to you, right? What is important for you? What do you value in the reading of a text? It's a bit like that. It's like a mode of thinking that you internalize and that you apply in some sense as a frame, right, to make sense of any kind of text. So it's not necessarily like you'll have, there are people who've tried to come up with a scheme of things you look for in a post-structural analysis, but I'd like to think of it as a kind of orientation, right? So I will sort of take you through what I think are very relevant to deconstruction as a kind of critical practice, or what comes close to a method for post-structuralism as a school of criticism, right? And these are concepts that are important from the point of view of deconstruction. So we've been talking a lot about the order and implied order that exists in the world as, understood by structuralist thinkers. So I think one of the first things to start with in post-structuralism is the questioning of that order, right? Where they're in some sense asking the question. They're not necessarily asking the question, are you sure there's order in the world? Rather, they're questioning the system through which that order has been posited, right? The system posits that this underlying order exists through difference, right? There are differences only in a system, where you differentiate one sign from the other because it's either, in some ways it's written differently, it sounds different, right? It looks different. So in that sense, you have these differences in the system. But Derrida introduces a complication in this argument by proposing that there may not necessarily only be differences in the system, right? Because differences imply equal things that are being compared. Okay? That's an important principle to keep in mind, that it implies that equal things are being compared, or contrasted, if you will. Difference also implies an absolute difference. It means that at no level can you see any kind of mixing or any kind of challenging of the boundary. Let's go back at this point to an example we've already looked at. What happens in the Levistro example? Right? The Levistro example told you that you have some universal systems of making sense of kinship rules and incest taboo, but at the same time it's different in each case. It's different in each location, right? And that kind of causes Derrida to kind of question this whole system and say that, look, you're saying the system is based on differences, and you're also saying that these differences are absolute in the sense that there is no muddying or mixing of these boundaries. But having said that, how can something be universal and local at the same time? Isn't that kind of an odd thing that you have observed? So in some ways, what's happening here is pushing arguments of structuralism a little bit further than they have been, or questioning that method through which these system of differences was understood. Here are some of the ways in which post-structuralist critics or people who have in some sense applied deconstruction have tried to make sense of these differences, right? One is that they suggest that boundaries between words are in many ways porous, right? They're not really as final as structuralists make it out to be. And they give you different examples for this, right? One example that we can start with is that any time that you have to refer to a word and differentiate it from another word in the system, inevitably you have to compare it to the thing that it is not, or bring up a set of other words that are related to it, which means that you never really invoke a word in isolation, right? So there is that initial sort of instance of the absent presence, meaning the presence of something which is not entirely a presence, but in some sense invokes the thing that is also not quite that thing that you're discussing. You're all with me, right? Yes. So this leads to a kind of denial of finality and meaning, right? How can you arrive at a final destination of meaning? How can you guarantee that with that sign tree, you reach the signifier tree? Because aren't you in some sense opening up this line of questioning where you're saying tree, but then you have to, in some sense, if you think of the process, differentiate it from all other signs in the system, right? And in some sense, you have to work out at what level these differences are absolute. And if they're not, and if every time you're invoking a tree or you're invoking, say, it's useful to think about, say, a color spectrum. If you're always going to be thinking of the thing that the color is not, right? You're talking about black, but you always have to make references to the fact that it's not white, but it's also not quite these other colors. Then aren't you ending up in an endless chain of signification, right? The signification process is never complete. It doesn't land at some kind of final destination. Rather, it kind of keeps moving, right? It keeps eternally posing yet another signifier that you have to differentiate it from in the system. I have an example here from an essay by Hillis Miller, who writes this essay called "The Critic as Host." Okay, so if you haven't read it, I would recommend that you read it, just because the critic as host is a good sort of working out of what it looks like to write as as someone who is a practitioner of deconstruction, and also offers several useful examples and texts that have been looked at in the context of these arguments that he's using. So I want to give you one more sort of slightly more complex example for how these boundary crossings or these porous boundaries are being proposed in the system, right? It might seem odd, right, to say that in a system actually you don't have absolute distinction between terms. I mean, theoretically you're accepting it, but here is another slightly more complex example, right? The idea of the gift. And I like this example just because it's very relatable. A gift always implies reciprocity, right? A gift is a weird kind of transaction. It's not a transaction that can ever end. Do you guys agree? Have you been stuck in this loop? Right? And all along the way, there are difficult things that happen, right? Is the gift good enough? Is it not so good enough? And there is no universal system for valuation either, right? How do you kind of make sense of that? It's different in every context. It's also something that always opens you up for ever further giving and exchanging of gifts, right? And generally, there's no such thing as a free gift, right? There's no such thing as you just receive a gift and it doesn't mean anything. You may not necessarily exchange the exact same thing in return, but something is expected. That something is always going to be left over in that exchange of gifts, right? There is an additional example that Miller gives, right? So for those of you who, may have got lost somewhere along the way, we're looking at different examples or different ways of understanding what it means to say that concepts in the system, that is a cat and a dog, right? Or a tree and a boulder. These concepts in the system, how do we ensure that they are in fact as separate as structuralists posit that they are? These are different examples for the ways in which people have challenged that absolute difference, right? So one is the idea of the gift. And post-structuralists are also very interested in internal inconsistencies in meaning. What does that mean? That means that they are very interested in the history of what a term means, right? So they're very interested in etymologies and in finding the roots and the thing that the word actually meant at some point, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that many of the words we use now are, in some sense, they exist in the present, but you will find that they carry the weight of all the meanings that have been associated with them. Therefore, there is a huge possibility for misunderstanding, right? There's a huge possibility for giving offense. It's never as straightforward as just using the word and ensuring that exactly what you meant is what ends up happening. So there are some, examples that are offered that are well-known ones, and I've listed them here. One is the gift. So the gift itself, in some sense, also implies poison. Okay, in a sense, it's the absolute opposite of what you'd expect a gift is meant to do, right? So if the gift is not necessarily a thank you, but rather an invitation to danger, then that radically destabilizes what you're expecting or thinking of when you use the word gift, or you're trying to make sense of the word gift. There are some other words like this. Do you know about the the pharmacy one. Do you know why I've listed pharmacy? So pharmacy also has a sense of the person who makes, so pharmacy has the sense in the Greek of the person who makes the medicine, but the person who makes poison. Right? So it could be both. It could mean the person who makes medicine, it could also be the person who makes poison. Right? Because there are related senses of someone who is preparing something. Right? And so in that situation, there is, one single word is giving you a sense of trustworthiness, right? A feeling that this medicine could solve a problem, but at the same time, it could also begin the problem, right? This is true of host as well. Host actually carries the sense of guest within it, which is the primary sort of example that Hillis Miller uses, right? So if host and guest are linked, there again you have a similar kind of problem, right? Both are not necessarily terms which you think can be combined together, but both senses are united in that one word, right? Culture is another interesting term of this kind, right? It has a long history of use. It has a long history of use that has changed over time, sometimes meaning very different things. Just as an example, the very first instance of culture is in the sense of cultivation, right? So you have a sense of bacteria as culture, which we also continue to use as a sense now. And then culture has had so many different senses and interpretations over the years, right? In the 18th century, a sense of external accomplishment, but a fight with, the idea that no, it should be something that you internally kind of, foster, right? And the same with literature, right? Prior to the 18th century, no one really thought of literature in the special sense that we're thinking about it today, okay? Rather just words that are written. So these are all examples for how there are inconsistencies within the terms that, don't allow us to see the system as being different. Okay, so here I have my second example before I move on to some of the implications of these, concepts. This is perhaps a criticism that, this is perhaps something we can call a criticism. It's not necessarily a critique of structuralism alone, right? Something that Derrida is doing. It's not necessarily a criticism of structuralism per se, but it's a critique of a way of organizing knowledge. Okay, let me put it that way. A criticism of a way of organizing knowledge, which is what here we are calling logocentrism, right? Before I go into describing the term, I want you to just have a look at these terms that I've listed here. We've talked about a few of them, right? So we've talked about raw and cooked, okay? We've also talked about nature and culture, because the Levistro example is meant to make you think about how there is a natural sort of preference not to have sexual relations with your kin, but also some specific things that are insisted on by your family or community, right? So something that belongs in nature and culture. But I'd like you to just look at the other terms for a while and tell me if there's anything that you observe about them. Not from this row, because I keep forgetting I banned you. Any observation at all, okay, about these set of terms? Sorry? Okay, good. They are opposites. So you're getting that broad sense of opposition here, right? Because this is something that I'll try and ask you to do when you're reading the text in the afternoon. I'll try and ask you to come up with a similar set like this, right? That can. So in the structuralist approach to a literary text, it's a very common practice to try and do this, right? Are there these stark opposites that are being set up in the text? Is there a good and evil, right? Is there an inside and outside? Okay, so you're trying to sort of do this at every level in the structure and texture of the story. But any other observations about this? Yes, you're right, they're opposites. They give that sense of a contrast. Is it from the banned row or? Oh, yeah, excellent. So which one is privileged? The one on the left, right? So I've also written it down in this way that it seems clear to you that one of the observations that Derrida is making, right, in addition to the fact that there are internal inconsistencies in the sign, okay, he's also making this observation that in a systemic sense, when you're thinking about order and an implied order, there is a term that is always privileged over the other, okay, And this order is not very explicit in the system. It seems to be this ghostly principle that just orders meaning in the system, right? A very easy example for this would be, say, to think about God, right, in a system that is organized, say, around religious thinking, where you're never going to question, so you're never going to question the principle that, you know, God is the one that began everything, or that God is on the side of truth and justice and rightness, right? And, you know, the way that, you know, post-structuralists define it is to say that the logocentrism, the real evidence of it existing in a body of knowledge is to see that the thing that that system really values, that is all the things that are privileged, right? The principle that values them never becomes part of the system, right? So in the God example, God will not in some sense be a part of the example. Many cultures even have stories about even the anti-God being created by God, right? So you in some sense have this original principle that's never questioned. So I've listed examples of that in the context of structuralism. So for structuralism, the structure is never questioned, right? No matter what, no matter what you say about how there is no intrinsic meaning in the sign and there is this objective truth that comes from examining differences, it is never questioned that the structure is important and that it is important to have structure in the world, right? That principle is valued. Clearly structure is valued over not having structure, and structure is in some sense not questioned. The determinacy of meaning, right, is also not questioned. That's another example of a system of knowledge. If you broadly want to think about literary analysis that focuses on, say, form, right? Most of you would have encountered literary analysis in school, which came with this, you know, implication that there is one right answer, right? I'm not sure even now actually that you're not being told there is one right answer. I think it's quite common, right? There's one kind of reading that is privileged. So you do reach or arrive at a certain place at the end of a text, right? No matter how objectively you put together your systems and say that it's because of the opposition between these two forces, it's because the narrative is ordered as a frame story and as a, you know, a longer sort of segment of exposition. No matter what you say, you're still arriving at that place where you say this is a detective novel, right? Or this is, you know, a story that is about, say, a set of themes, right? So the determinacy of meaning is also not questioned. I've put down the primacy of the self as another example of a body of knowledge that has, you know, this kind of logos. By that I only mean a way of making sense of the individual, right? So a way of making sense of the individual that privileges a kind of autonomy and freedom and existence for this individual that is entirely in their control, okay? I think, therefore I am, okay? That statement, in some sense, takes for granted that you have control over your processes of thinking, right? And you have a very clear understanding of who you are, okay? So here, like the God principle, here you are at the center of the system, right? You can very clearly define who you are with no doubt whatsoever, right? And you will never question that idea that you yourself is something that you can't explain very clearly. You are the master of who you are, right? You can explain clearly who you are. So that's one other example of logos in a system that talks about the ways of making sense of the individual, right? So this is something that Derrida is pointing out, that all systems seem to be organized by this principle, which governs which term is privileged, right? So it's not just a system of differences actually. It's a system of hierarchical differences, and that hierarchy is kept in place by the logos. And that's something that isn't questioned, right? And so this is something that he is pointing out. So here are some sort of famous examples from Derrida, right? That speech somehow always seems to be privileged over writing. The reason for that being that there is the implied presence of a speaker, and presence is always seen as valued greater than absence, right? And being over not being. So some of you mentioned this example in a horror film about, you know, the supernatural force, right? So our whole sort of sense of making meaning from an element of fear there comes from the fact that being is privileged over non-being, right? You're always trying to solve the problem of the non-being, that the non-being is in some sense out of place, right? So here again, being is privileged over non-being, and he's kind of making a comment about Western, various systems of Western knowledge and thinking overall. Okay, so I'm going to move on from this. This was okay. I don't have a summary following this, but we're just going to move on now to what I think are some implications of this. So it is possible that several of you have encountered this in some way and have a way of, sort of articulating it yourself. But I thought it would be useful to talk about what the implications of this are, right? What are the implications for our thinking? And therefore, what are the implications for meaning making? I think one of the primary implications for us is reading and making sense of meaning, right? So when you're using deconstruction as a critical practice, as we will in some of our texts today, you will be looking for constitutive meaning rather than opposition, right? What does that mean? That means that deconstruction is not expecting you to find, these paired opposites and then say that, what, for so many years light has been privileged over dark, now let me do it the other way around, right? That's not really what they're asking. They're sort of suggesting that meaning is constitutive, right? Meaning that it is involving something other than one sort of unitary, concrete, absolute difference. So there are constitutive meanings. Words have presences of other meanings and other words in them, much like, as I will show you in a later example, texts also in some senses have presences of other things in them. So they're also in some senses interested in uncertainty as much as they are interested in certainty. This can be something that can get quite challenging when you're reading, because it's a very odd thing to accept that you're reading, but you're reading for uncertainty. But it's something that, the post-structuralists are, they're sort of inviting you to do, right? And they're not necessarily saying uncertainty is the best thing, so let's leave it there. But rather that there is a certain cohabiting of both uncertainty and certainty, right? So yes, we're certain about some things, but we're uncertain about several other things. And, these two sets of ideas actually speak to one another in the text, right? They're quite comfortable sitting together. We're not privileging one or pushing the other out. They're also in some senses interested in what is valued in the system you're looking at, right? They're very critical about that. So if you're reading a literary text, then they're very interested in the organizing principle. So if you read a literary text and come up with a set of paired opposites like this, right? Let's say you have a lot of maybe human, animal, man, woman, like a set of things that are relevant to that text. Post-structuralists are interested in finding what is the thing that holds that set of hierarchies together. There seems to be on a first reading something that's privileged. So let's look at it and try and see what's the thing that holds that organizing principle together, right? They're taking a different view of language than the structuralists, right? They're not necessarily keeping language as a given, right? Or as a system that exists frozen at a certain moment in time, like our linguists were doing, right? Rather, they're fairly irreverent about language, right? So they're very playful in the way that they write and in the way that they interpret texts. We saw the example of etymology, right? But there was also the difference of a pun, right? So when we looked at difference, it's a very clever mixing together of two words and then written in a language where you can't quite tell that these two are different. So written in French, that spelling in some sense can imply both difference and deference. And both these are very kind of, difficult things to bring together in a single word, right? Because one is about absolute sort of difference, right? A finality of meaning. This ends here because it's not the same as that. And then another term which is suggesting that there is a constant movement, eternal kind of moving or never arriving of meaning. Right? So they come up with new terms, they play with language in that sense, right? So that's why the irreverence with language. Post-structuralism is also interested, is also very interested in intertextuality. So at some level, you may have thought about intertextuality in terms of identifying the allusion, right? Any kind of poem that you have been taught to interpret from early years of your education will tell you that here is an allusion. But I think most of the work used to stop there, right? At least when I studied, that's what it was. I thought the job was to identify the allusion, and then you're happy. Someone else said this. But what's the implication of that, right? What's the implication of finding somebody else's words, right, in a text that you're attributing in a unique and original way to someone, right? What are the implications of finding many such quotations? So if a text is only composed of things that are borrowed from elsewhere, what does that then imply? Okay? there are other ways of thinking of intertextuality, right? Often people very consciously choose to have an homage to another text, right? So you're invoking another writer's presence constantly as you write. Okay, and there are a variety of reasons why people do this. Adaptations similarly work primarily with another text, right? But what's the relationship that they share? Is it a hierarchical one, right? Or is it a relationship that in fact suggests that a text is not in that sense as bounded as we assume, right? It doesn't begin with the title, with the very first line that's invoked, and it doesn't necessarily end with that last sort of, maybe a summary question that you find at the end of it. Rather, it invites you to look at it for all the presences of several kinds of things that this text has absorbed, right? And that it has this kind of push and pull relationship with. It brings much of that text in, but it also changes it, and it also in that sense contributes to the reading of that other text. Okay, so that's one sense in which post-structuralism thinks of the text as very open-ended. It doesn't sort of establish finality, originality, a sense of, creation to the text. Okay, so in some sense then here it's a kind of related implication that there are no origins and destinations either, right? So you may not in a post-structuralist analysis spend a lot of time finding that one sort of biographical moment at which the writer intended to say something, right? Or that this writer's life actually was invoked in the reading of what he has produced. The author's context is one of many kinds of things that you might look at while inspecting a text, right? And it's not necessarily one that's privileged, and not privileged as the very first thing that you do or the place where it all began. The same with the destination, right? It doesn't, there's no last or final sort of meaning that you reach there at the end of the text. There's also a sense for why you read what you read, right? Are you reading because you want to take away some sort of central idea from this author that you're looking at? Because as I said, it's a very odd method of reading to suggest that you're reading in order to be uncertain, right? And here is another odd thing that is implied by the fact that meaning never arrives. The other thing it implies is that anything that you may consider marginal to the text you may find is not so marginal, right? Examples of this could be a meaning of a word that you find in the text that reveals all these other meanings that in some sense has changed how you are seeing that paragraph or that text that you're reading. It could also be a footnote, right? It could be a single allusion. These are things that you would otherwise think of as very marginal to the text, right? But they become very central to the text's interpretation within a post-structuralist analysis, right? So there is a certain contamination of what you would otherwise think of as a central principle of the text. Can I move on from this? So now I want to come to some of the things that are true of not necessarily reading, but a set of ideas that are related to reading and interpretation. One of those ideas are related to identity. You can think of identity in different ways, okay? You can think of identity in terms of what we think of as the person whose identity is very important to interpretation, and that person is the author, right? We often think of the author as being an important figure who gives us the source or the meaning of a text, right? So when meaning is not final and words have internal inconsistencies, one of the first kind of terms or kinds of identities that come into question are, the author's identity. So Foucault has pointed out two kinds of interesting internal inconsistencies in the meaning of the term author, right? One that you might know is the historical inconsistencies. You know the historical inconsistencies to the meaning of the term author, right? That the author is someone who is copyrighted, protected, right, for the work that he is doing, as someone that you invite for talks and lectures and then talk about, right? This is something that's it's a very modern kind of idea for the author, right? There were always, and they still continue to be, things that are written whose authors we don't really care about, right? Do you know the author who wrote the scintillating prose in the little booklet that comes along with any digital device that you buy? No, right? You're not going and looking up that author and saying, where was this person born, right? Were they, are they from Delhi? So in that sense, you're not really doing this investigative work of finding out who the author is, what did he think, how did he feel, how did what he write kind of get implied in the story. So you don't have that sense of the author. Because there is a historical kind of inconsistency in how the author is defined. So you have, say, you may have had in the Middle Ages a situation in which treatises were written by anonymous, right? No name mentioned. Versus the 18th century where you require the book to be pinned on one person so you can arrest them for writing something seditious, right, against the government, right, or against, someone who's saying that, okay, no, monarchy must fall, right, and then you have to have someone's name attached to that piece of writing so that you can find them, hold them accountable. So many kinds of inconsistencies in what we think of as the author. In the present, when we talk about the author, there are inconsistencies in what we want the term to mean. We want the term to be associated with someone who is... What are the senses we have? If I said author, right, and I asked you to name a set of synonyms, what kinds of things would you say? Would any of you say plagiarizer? No, you wouldn't? Okay. I mean, you're allowed to. So I'm just... What words come to mind if I say author? Creative, good. Writer, okay. Manipulator, okay, good. We have one slightly negative sense. Any other senses of author? Owner, okay. Someone who's at the top of a hierarchy. So do you mean socially they are well known? That's what you mean, or?
Close to authority.
Sorry?
Close to the term authority.
Okay, so the sense of property, okay, and ownership. Time? How long do I have?
We have 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay, so I will wrap up. I like to do this exercise where people hand in notes that they write to the author. So if all of you were to imagine what it would be like if you wrote a little note to your author, then you will find what kind of cultural sense you inhabit for what we think of as the author. Many of you are either likely to say that I wish I could have met you. Many of my students often write that thank you for writing this book. Right? So there is this way in which you kind of award this person the capacity to create infinitely, right? But at the same time, you want to make sure that ownership and property is also established, right? So he says that there are these two very contrary ways in which we make sense of author, and it's an example for the term internal inconsistency in the term. Another sense that Foucault gives us within post-structuralism that will become important for the other schools of criticism you'll encounter is this sense of a subject rather than a self. Okay? What that means essentially is that rather than being this unbounded, free individual that has autonomy, right, in the sense that is invoked by I and by the sense of the self in I think therefore I am, right, rather than the sense that's invoked by that, what you have here is someone who is subject to several things. Subject to should give you a sense of, in some sense, being controlled by, right? Subject to definitely does not give a sense of freedom or in some sense, having autonomy, right? So Foucault is kind of identifying this various systems that you are subject to, the first being language. Okay, so one simple example that you can think of is your name. You may think of it as being unique in some sense to you and identifying you as an individual, but it is situated in a larger context, right? It's situated in a gendered sense, it's situated in a cultural sense, in a social sense. So there are many ways in which your name in some sense is already determined, right? You're subject to the forces of that culture that in some sense named you. Okay, so I'll kind of pause here for the kinds of concepts to keep in mind and the implications for the interpretations we're going to do in the afternoon. But I tried to think a little bit about what it means to think in the context of post-structuralism and Indian writing in English, right? What are the ways in which one can find it useful to look at Indian writing in English via post-structuralism? And I've listed a few what I thought were forms and themes, right? Just because I wasn't quite sure what kinds of texts you guys would know and whether we could, discuss those. But autobiographies are often very interesting spaces in which to think of some of the things we talked about. Implied order, right? As opposed to the presence of order and disorder, okay? And a lot of states which can be confusing. So the autobiography plays around, I mean, since this idea of play is very significant in post-structuralism, it plays around a lot with the idea of truth and memory, right? So suddenly there is this individual, so if you think of, I'm thinking of something like M and the Big Whom, right? How many of you have read Jerry Pinto's M and the Big Whom? What about Ants Among Elephants? Right? So some of these stories typically in the realm of the, memoir and the autobiography are often not saying the story of an individual as you think that they would. They kind of play around with the boundary of individual and family and individual and community. And you find that there is a lot of worry and concern that everything you remember may not be sufficient to tell the story. You have to constantly rely on the memory of others. Right? And there's this constant problematizing of what you remember, what your family remembers, what are the living memories you can capture, right? And many of these sort of autobiographies keep on speaking about the ways that they recorded this, right? Here is how I collected my information. Here are the number of people I interviewed, right? So there's a constant need to justify that, work was kind of collected in a particular way, rather than autobiography being assumed as just the telling of your own personal story. I put crime fiction here just in the off chance that people are into crime fiction. How many of you like crime fiction or, detective stories? Okay, so I thought that crime fiction is a useful way. I don't know how many of you read crime fiction. Do you read crime fiction written in India? Crime fiction? Chetan Bhagat? Okay, I don't know that, but I put crime fiction here for basically helping you think of the genre question. So you remember we talked earlier about the genre being the place where you see the implied order and you predict the structure. Crime fiction, like several other kinds of genre fiction, relies on it for its popularity on readers being able to predict patterns. You're not going to be very popular if the person is going to have the reaction I just did, right? That really, is this really a crime novel, right? So you're kind of depending on the prediction of the pattern, but at the same time, I think with post-structuralism, what you can also see is the porousness of these boundaries, right? There are often very interesting ways in which crime fiction is working with other genres as well and not necessarily sticking to your classic versions of the genre. So I was thinking of someone like Sujata Massey. If you haven't read Sujata Massey, I would recommend that you read Sujata Massey's Parveen Mystery series. Right? So I think there are 3 in the series now. Parveen Mystery is modeled on Cornelia Sorabji. Right? So she's this crime-fighting advocate. And through her, you get a sense for late 19th, early 20th century India and the condition of women and their education. So it's partly historical fiction, partly crime fiction. Crime fiction also does very interesting things with the idea of justice, right? And the idea of what crime is. So often you find there are very blurry boundaries here for where is the wrongdoing happening, right? So there's a detective that's, investigating a crime where at the same time, in some senses being abused by the system or being abused by the family. So there are crimes which are punished, crimes which are unpunished, and there are very interesting ways in which these novels model these sets of opposites. I'll wrap up with these 2. So both of these, I think we can find versions of a few of these in the text when we look at them when we look at it in the afternoon. But a lot of Indian writing in English does very interesting things with encounters, right? Between just sets of people. The story we're reading in the afternoon, as you know, is one of those classic encounters, right? Between an Indian and a foreigner. And stories which tell, you will have a talk on migration studies. So stories that talk about migration, stories that talk about, say, events like the partition, will often talk about contact between 2 cultures that in public memory are terribly different, but then set about exploring similarities as well, right? And then the book challenges your perception of differences and similarities in what are considered to be otherwise very opposed kinds of people and regions. There are also ways in which a lot of vernacular fiction. So how many of you read Perumal Murugan? Okay. How many of you have read a novel called Mustache? by S. Harish. So these I think belong in, I mean, maybe this might come up in the talk on eco-criticism, but these novels I think belong in a version of, the kind of writing that we'll look at in R.K. Narayan, where there is a kind of very detailed immersion in rural life, right? But rural life of a region, right? I suppose R.K. Narayan is a little more, removed from cultural context. There are references to Tamil, but Mustache and, say, Perumal Murugan's stories give you that very deep immersion in a local dialect, in a region, where interestingly you see a lot of internal inconsistencies. Okay? So several of these texts will build a picture of a nation or a region or even a family across many generations, right? They tell you an intergenerational story, only to show you that these are internally heterogeneous systems, such that the system then becomes untenable as a unified whole. So you're not necessarily committing to the idea that the family is one cohesive unit where everyone thinks and feels the same, much like the region as well, right? So these are some of my examples for the kinds of themes that you can think about for IWE. And I'm done. Thank you, everyone. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Sundaram, for that close engagement with post-structuralism and for giving us a broad yet detailed overview of the school of thought.